Hello from the Route 66 Spirit of America Museum in Stroud, Oklahoma. If you are watching from Stroud, you already know we are in Stroud, Oklahoma. If you are not, welcome to small town America, a wonderful community that is the home of this museum for the last 2 years. I am Steve Brant, the founder and director of the museum. This is my good friend Marilyn, who is partner in crime with me on these monthly speaker series.
Friend of the museum at large.
Marilyn Hudson is a researcher, author, and a professional storyteller. Many different subjects of interest, although one of her special interest areas is UFOs, and I invite you to look up Marilyn Hudson and UFOs if you want to have some fascinating reads. But today we're here to talk about the launch pad for innovations, because innovations is the pretty much the cornerstone of the museum's reason for existing. There we go, a little better screening. So, Marilyn, anything you would like to say to greet people?
No, well, hello to everyone that's watching. We appreciate your turning in and learning something about the museum. I'm anxious just to hear what you have to say.
Well, thank you. And as I was thinking about today, one of the memories I have from my childhood is the story of the Three Little Pigs.
Mm-hmm.
And as I reflected on innovation, the Three Little Pigs were innovating in the area of how they lived, what kind of homes they lived in. And their motivation for the process they went through was to protect themselves from the big bad wolf.
That's right.
And so we had the pigs first building a home out of straw, and then they learned quickly that the wolf could knock that down with a big huff and a puff and blow your house over. They then went to a house built out of wood, and it turned out the big bad wolf didn't have too much trouble with that either. They finally built a house out of a brick, and that was the solution to being able to survive the wolf's efforts. And this is part of the way I've thought since childhood, in a way, is how could I make things better? And it's one of the reasons why innovation appeals to me. I was thinking about wanting things to be better ever since I was little. And it was partly because I'm a product of the 1960s, and at age 8, I saw on television that the nation was mourning the assassination of President Kennedy. And it was a pretty traumatic thing for an 8-year-old to learn our president can get killed. So I wanted to imagine our country being better, and at the same time, my family was fairly dysfunctional. So at the same time, as I witnessed the presidency going through this, I was also wondering how my family could be better. It's kind of a mantra, and wanting to imagine things being better is actually also what the founding fathers were thinking when they created our country. The big change they wanted was to no longer be ruled by a king. No taxation without representation. They felt they were abused by a domineering political force. And what did they do? They got themselves together and they figured out maybe we can create a self-rule nation, not a dominated by a king nation. That's big time innovation. To make a change from a straw house to a wooden house to a brick house is significant, but it's not like going from a king being in charge to everybody being in charge. In fact, that's what I consider the two kinds of innovation categories. One is innovation that makes things better but doesn't ultimately change the overall dynamic, because the wolf was still out there. And I bet given enough time, he might have figured out how to invent dynamite, and then the brick house, or the coyote and the roadrunner, he would have gone to Acme, and Acme would have sold him something to. Now I'm creating a cartoon mashup here. Sorry about that. But what the founding fathers did was they didn't just make it easier to live with a king, or less violence or less taxation, for example. They actually figured out how to get rid of the king. I mean, not bury him, but just make him not germane to their lives. And so that's the category of innovation where you literally open up an entirely new world, an entirely new future. Self-rule is a huge leap forward compared to being ruled. And it's not an easy change, and that's part of the story of innovation, is that sometimes if you decide to do something really big and new, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's also not going to be simple. Another example I love in the world of innovation is we decided to go to the moon, and it was a huge commitment, and at the time they knew they didn't have all the details figured out. The basics were known. In fact, one of the proud archival items in the museum is the Conquest of Space book published in 1951. So if you come to the museum, you can see some history. This book will actually turn 75 years old next year, and I hope to figure out a way to really celebrate 75 years of the rocket scientists working to let the public know that they'd figured out how to make going into space no longer the stuff of science fiction, but the stuff of future fact. So they published this book to educate the public, and they were really smart in that they went to a man who was a Hollywood background painter named Chesley Bonestell, and they had him paint pictures for their book that gave people a vision of what being in space was going to look like, not just words on a page. And
marvelous art. Marvelous art.
Yes, marvelous, photorealistic, and Walt Disney, who was opening Disneyland just a few years later in 1955, saw all this, and he actually went to the rocket scientists and Chesley Bonestell and said, "I'm gonna put you on television," and the result was an episode of The Wonderful World of Disney in 1955, simply called Man in Space. And if you go on YouTube and you plug in Disney Man in Space, you can watch him interviewing all those rocket scientists, showing people models of what they knew we could have, using animation and music and humor to tell the story of what we had now figured out. So that's the piece of innovation that is also critical. If you decide you want to do something new, sometimes it's a bit of a journey to get that to happen. But the journey is part of the excitement, because you get to learn. You get to collaborate with people to figure answers out. The line I've heard is that they literally felt there were a million things, they had a million problems they had to solve to go from this book and the rockets that existed in the very beginning, like the V2 that was imported from Germany, to the kind of rocket that we ultimately used to take us to the moon, the Saturn V. And if you come to the museum, you can see the tribute to that first step on the moon with a Saturn V rocket, as well as a quarter-scale statue of the first step on the moon. So there's a huge breakthrough kind of innovation that I really love to talk to people about, and the learning journey that is part of that innovation is just as exciting as the vision of wanting to achieve it. And one of the reasons why the learning part matters to me is, in order to be in learning mode, it has to be okay to make mistakes along the way.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, you're not going to have all the answers right away. So how do you get from not having all the answers to having the answers? Well, you experiment. You try things out. And sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. I mean, even in the space program, the early rockets that we had around 1960, before we put people in them, they tended to blow up on the launch pad.
Yes, they did.
There are some famous, footage of the news covering that, NASA is new and they've got this program. We're going to get to the moon, and boom,
Mm-hmm.
well, that didn't work. But they kept at it. They didn't let failure stop them. Even the tragedy of the Apollo 1 fire, which wasn't even a launch, it was just testing out the Apollo capsule. An early version of the Apollo capsule turned out to be a fire trap, and it caught fire, and we lost 3 astronauts, and it was a national tragedy, and we mourned them, of course, but we didn't stop, because the purpose of going someplace you've never gone before is to admit it can be risky, and we today fortunately have managed to go to the International Space Station multiple times, and we haven't lost anybody. We had the 2 space shuttles that were separate disasters from the International Space Station, but we've gotten pretty good at getting up to the space station and back. And that's because we kept learning, and we kept improving, and we kept figuring out, okay, this might be dangerous, let's see what we can do to make it less dangerous, to reduce the risk. So, and the key piece of this learning process I want to emphasize is that we aren't really a culture that celebrates our mistakes. When you're a kid in school, basically every time you make a mistake on a test, you get a worse grade. So you don't really like making mistakes when you're a kid, and yet how can you learn if you don't make mistakes? It's kind of a dichotomy. We're taught in school that mistakes mean you get a bad grade, but in life, making mistakes is the only way we get smarter. So I wish we could kind of do away with the mistakes are bad mindset, and while you don't want kids to think that they've got all the answers if they literally don't, you don't want to beat them up, accuse them of being unable to learn. Yeah. Everybody learns in their own way.
Yeah. I think the 3 Pigs is a wonderful example, because what that teaches is that our learning and our mistake making are both a part of a process. You have to go through this process of learning, failing, succeed, in order to actually reach whatever your goal is.
Yes.
And I think that's what's embedded in that fairy tale so wonderfully. It's like, okay, yeah, oh, that wasn't a good idea. Well, all right, let's try this. Oh, that wasn't a good idea. Well, why don't we try this? Learning from those previous mistakes, and they applied what they'd learned, and they succeeded. So I think you see that same process going on in like the early space program. Yeah, there were mistakes. There was egg on the United States' face because we couldn't seem to get anything to fly. But we were learning with each and every one of those experiences. And nobody knew what they were doing, really.
Well,
we had this dream. It's like, we want to do this, but we're not really too clear about how we're going to do it.
Right.
So
right.
They were learning, failing, succeeding.
Yeah, and the Russians, of course, were racing us to the moon. So it did help to have competition.
Yeah.
But they didn't have it all figured out either,
No.
and they ultimately abandoned the landing program after we did it. I don't know.
And they lost a couple of their astronauts in space, and so.
Yes, they did, didn't they? Yeah. But well, now I'm thinking of a motion picture. I'd like to believe that this motion picture actually captured some of the spirit of our contest with the Russians. There was a motion picture called Marooned, in which we had a space crew that were stranded, and the Russians actually sent a space mission up to help us. And of course, we had the Apollo-Soyuz mission where we actually did partner in space for the first time. So even as we were racing, and of course now today, moving forward a few decades, we've got the partnership in the International Space Station with Russia, which has managed to survive even in the crazy reality of today's
and we've
politics.
had the wonderful experience of seeing many other nations sending in up the first people, from India, from Japan, various
European Union
countries. That's just so exciting. It's so wonderful to see that kind of collaboration, partnership. Yeah.
Which gets me to one of the special innovations that the museum celebrates, which is not brand new. It's funny because, again, we needed to figure out a million things to get to the moon. Today, to get to a place where we are not at each other's throats, both globally and even locally, some might think, oh my gosh, we can't even get there because it's impossible.
That's right.
Well, if you go back in time to the World War II era, and we needed to build a whole lot of tanks and planes and other weapons, you discover that there was someone the government brought in who had figured out how people can make a lot of things as quickly as possible and have them work. And the key was to give up what was the most popular approach to business at the time, which is the boss is always right. And there were factories where there was a classic sign on the wall. I should see if I can find a photograph of it. The sign on the wall said, I pay you to work, not to think. And that was because the boss ran the show like he was the king.
That's right.
And the workers were just given their jobs and told, crank out X number of widgets a day and forget about talking to me, the boss, about how things ought to be done better, because I know the way to do things. So the government somehow discovered this management pioneer named W. Edwards Deming. And he brought in his we are all in this together philosophy, where there is no boss that's running the show like a king. There's a boss, of course, but he's more like a coach. He helps people rather than directs people. Or I should say, he helps people rather than orders people. There's still a certain amount of direction necessary, like the director of a movie. But the director of the movie doesn't tell the cameraman how to do his job. He lets the cameraman, because the cameraman is an expert in that. And so what W. Edwards Deming helped bring to the World War II effort was a collaborative model of producing what we need to produce. And not only was it that boss is now more of a coach or a director than a boss or a king, the people were now talking to each other and sharing lessons they were learning every day about, well, maybe this part doesn't fit the way it should. Hey, we can make it fit better tomorrow if we do X, Y, and Z. And so it was a learning culture, a learning organization model.
Precipitative management.
Participatory, yes. Yeah. Participatory management, yes. The workers on the assembly lines were just as important. In some regards, they might have been seen as more important because they saw the problem first.
And they give that feedback.
Yes.
Yeah, important.
Yes. So the collaborative model that would benefit us all today
Mhm.
is not new.
Mhm.
It was pioneered decades ago and codified not just by the one man, W. Edwards Deming, but a whole collective of people
Mhm.
who created what is sometimes called the quality management movement. The American Society for Quality still exists. There are other organizations that promote this approach of cooperative and learning-based organizational culture. And in a world where there is still an awful lot of emphasis on the boss is always right and the kind of competition that is cutthroat in nature, because you literally want the other people to fail and die as opposed to just, maybe not be as good.
Mhm.
But in the world that Deming championed, you actually create a learning environment between corporations, because it's the old a rising tide lifts all boats philosophy.
Right.
What Deming championed, and this still exists in a government program called the Baldrige Performance Excellence Program, is that if you really have figured things out, you should be willing to teach other companies how you do it, because you are the first mover, and you've got the advantage of having figured things out. But you don't want just your little part of society or your part of your industry to be a beneficial or beneficiary of these insights and this knowledge. You really want to share it, because again, we can all win.
Right.
Instead of a culture of winners and losers, was pretty much Deming's foundational insight. The world of World War II, of course, was a win-lose world. It was either going to be democracy or fascism, but that's a different kind of contest. If the contest is how can an automobile be made to work on less gasoline or something, we should have all cars benefiting from that mechanical knowledge. So the museum is a place to learn the solutions that were actually figured out a long time ago on this giant subject of can we all I'm trying to remember who it was who said this, can we all finally learn how to get along? There was somebody who said that years ago. I'll have to look his name up. But I invite people to appreciate that we know we have problems, but we aren't at day one of wanting to go to the moon. We are actually at day one of a lot of us learning that people like W. Edwards Deming figured a tremendous amount of things out, and the government actually still champions that philosophy through the Baldrige Performance Excellence Program. But we are not, again, at ground zero or the starting point. We are at the starting point of our public understanding, but not of the science. And in a way, I'll just include this thought, it's kind of like we need a version of the Conquest of Space book, or today's version of the kind of public education that these rocket scientists knew was essential. They were quite clear that it wasn't enough that they figured this out. They wanted the public to learn that they had these answers to the great quest to explore the stars, and they got help from Hollywood. And the combination of science and Hollywood actually is a piece of the puzzle for the public education that I am aiming for the museum to champion, because the museum itself is a blend of real people and real solutions. There's the Deming tribute was actually expanding, so when the museum has its kind of reopening in June, there'll be more to see about what he did. But the museum is also a place where the entertainment world's ability to help us have a fun time
That's
learning
right.
all of this
That's right.
is celebrated, and that's why there's going to be a new and expanded. There's a small Star Wars tribute right now, but there's going to be a much more fun and playful Star Wars tribute.
You know what strikes me as really interesting is
Yes.
that you have this process of transforming the way people think, and this leading them into innovative thinking.
Yes.
And it didn't involve violence. It didn't involve armies. It didn't involve great political wars. It involved tapping into the imagination and spirit and dreams and hopes of people to move them forward. And that's a powerful, powerful image that they changed the way that we thought about being earthbound, not through, at the point of a gun saying, you're going to go to space.
Right.
It was more, we are going to go to space.
Right.
Exciting, wonderful new idea. Let's all do it. And that won the hearts and minds, I think, imaginations of people just worldwide.
That's a wonderful point. Yeah. Yes. It was a aspirational leap forward, not a forced
That's
leap.
right. Yeah.
We weren't marched into supporting NASA. We were inspired
to
by the dream.
Every grade school child, every teenager, every young person, it was a kind of a what if.
Yeah.
And
when there turned out to be problems along the way, especially I'm thinking of Apollo 13, where they had that accident on the way to the moon. The whole world was caught up in the drama because we wanted this to be a success, and we were fearful for their lives.
And I think in that moment they weren't Americans. They were human beings.
Yeah.
They were citizens of planet Earth. And I think everybody realized that that's us up there.
Yeah.
That's somebody like me. No matter what language I speak, no matter where I live, it was a human in peril. And that brought the world together in drama, in interest, in prayers, in ideas and imagination and everything else.
You remind me, I'm pretty sure there's a plaque on the lunar lander for the first lunar landing. Excuse me for saying the same words twice. And on that plaque are the words, "For all mankind." And let me see if I can find. So there's actually a film of that name, but in the Apollo program, where is the plaque? Oh, come on. Well, I will post this later, but NASA knew that they were racing against the Soviet Union, but they also knew that this was a human quest,
That's right.
not an American quest. And of course, again, the International Space Station attempts to continue that philosophy that we are all in this together. So we have resources that can get us to the future of our dreams, just as they have. We have created the resources we have needed in the past. One other thing the museum celebrates is that making a big leap doesn't always have to require that the normal conditions we are in are kind of calm. In other words, some people might say, oh, you want to do something really huge and bold? Well, gee, let's wait till we're not arguing with ourselves. Well, I was fascinated to learn a number of years ago that the Transcontinental Railroad project was kicked off by Abraham Lincoln in the middle of the Civil War. So that was a pretty contentious time in our country, yet it didn't stop Abraham Lincoln from thinking long term and authorizing this program. And the museum is also home to a book written to celebrate the Transcontinental Railroad completion, which took place in Promontory, Utah, on, of all things, the 10th of May, 1869. And today is the 10th of May.
Cool.
So we are literally celebrating the anniversary of the Golden Spike ceremony. And this book, which came out in 1994, was actually launched publicly on the 10th of May in Promontory, Utah. So if you come to the museum, you can see the author's signature.
And what a great example of somebody who was innovative and hopeful, because the Transcontinental Railroad, united the country in a way that will produce tremendous post-Civil War boom from one coast to the next. So hopeful, imaginative dreamers. We need them.
We do. And then, of course, the people who kicked off building Route 66 were no longer thinking railroads, they were now thinking automobiles. And what a wonderful, innovative, and imaginative leap that was.
That's right.
Because automobiles in 1926 were still pretty rudimentary. And
for most automobile travel, when you get to about Kansas City, you have completed your journey. The Route 66 opened up the West to America and the world in a way that had never been done before, and that's marvelous. The treasures and beauties that people have been able to enjoy just making that trip on Route 66 from Chicago to California. It really is the place to get your kicks.
yes, and innovation that helps people have better lives is the kind I feel we should all look for. One of the lessons I learned years ago from one of my teachers was that sometimes people develop something new, but it's not an automatic net positive to society. There can be things that can be used both negatively and positively. I mean, probably the easiest example is atomic energy. We developed atomic energy, and it was either, oh my God, a bomb, or oh, not so much of a terrible thing, nuclear power. Now, we can talk about nuclear power still needing to be made better, but at least that's a constructive effort to use nuclear power as opposed to a destructive effort.
That's right.
And I personally feel we don't talk about values enough when people are developing new things today. My current issue area is artificial intelligence. I've seen AI used in very fun and playful ways for images, and I just learned last night that there's a museum that took all of the writings of Frederick Douglass. I think it's the American Museum of the African American History. They took all of Frederick Douglass's writings and they fed them into an artificial intelligence engine, including photographs of Frederick Douglass, and you can visit this museum and you can literally interact with Frederick Douglass as a holographic figure.
Wow.
So there he is, and you can ask him questions, and based on the AI knowing everything that he ever said,
That's great.
can you imagine being able to talk to Frederick Douglass? We could do that with all kinds of people. I think William Shatner may have actually sat for a variation on that theme
Oh, wow.
within the last year or two, because he wants people to be able to talk to him when he's gone.
That's
Which is-
amazing.
Yeah,
That's
so
amazing.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
look for more information about the holographic Frederick Douglass, because that's AI for good. AI that starts to control things and maybe even starts to not be so easy for us to control, like there's no off switch,
Yeah.
makes
Yes.
me
Yeah.
nervous. I think there needs to always be an off switch.
And I think one of the things that we need to, innovation is so important. But we need to also make some pathways for people to be innovative and creative and make those landmark inventions and discoveries disconnected from anybody making money.
Fascinating.
Because give them grants to research and learn and innovate, make mistakes, create them with no intention of making money off of an end product.
Okay.
And let the discoveries flow. I mean, that's the same problem that we often have with drug research, is that they don't want to invest in drugs for diseases that only a few people have. But you need to have those people being able to research that kind of thing, regardless of how many pills they will sell.
Regardless of the profit motive.
And it's the same thing, I think innovation, there is a type of innovation that works well under the pressure of, I've got to perform, I've got to produce, I've got to get paid. But I think there's also another kind of innovation that works well under the umbrella of just being free to be creative.
Yes.
And just to say, oh, I know this is a weird out there idea, but because really basically that's the way a lot of the major inventions that we have in American history, in the global history, is because somebody just said, well, I wonder what would happen if.
Yeah, they weren't worried about making a buck.
That's right.
They were just curious.
So that kind of innovation that is very human oriented, just creation, innovation for the betterment of humankind.
Sure.
That's really what's needed, and that's where the billionaires and the millionaires could really help the human process by funding that kind of unrestrained, unrestricted
yes,
exploration and
unrestricted
discovery.
grants, where you allow people the flexibility to go
Right.
where they might not have known they were going to go when they submitted the original proposal.
That's right.
Yeah, that leads me to wonder, because Bill Gates, just within the last week, has announced that he is focusing all of his remaining time on giving his, I think he's got $200 billion to donate to causes, and he is working on getting that to happen. He doesn't want to die and have like $100 billion that he's going to leave to his family.
I'm sorry I'm late.
It's fine. There will always be the chance to rewatch.
I'm welcome with being, judged or whatever for me showing up late, but
No,
things
we're
got in the way.
We're not about that.
Yeah.
We're not about that.
We're happy to see
We're not
anybody
about
show
that
up.
here.
This is wonderful.
Right?
Yeah.
And Inky is saying hi from
Yeah.
a distance because he can't quite leap over Marilyn.
He's so lovely. And you know what,
He's gonna
Steve?
come down
I
the
really don't like cats. I like a few of them,
Mhm.
but he's cool.
Yeah, Inky is a mensch, if that's the right word.
He
We're
knows what's
gonna
going on.
wrap this up, Raquel, with a few final thoughts, and it really is great to have you here, Marilyn, because one of the points you just raised is innovation that doesn't require focus on profit, which is why there are research labs normally funded by the government, sometimes funded by, a Bill Gates type person.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, when I was a civil engineer, they literally sent me to a place in Vicksburg, Mississippi, where they had what was called the Waterways Experiment Station.
Mm-hmm.
And this was an Army Corps of Engineers research facility to study how rivers, mostly, but
Mhm.
also oceans, impact what we build. Because they didn't want us building things that could get easily
Yes.
washed away. I literally learned how to design something that would help with a beach that might be getting eroded by the ocean, and we didn't want to lose the beach because we needed the buffer. So there were ways that I was trained in preventing beach erosion.
Mm-hmm.
And this was, again, a government research facility. There wasn't a profit motive because the Army Corps of Engineers wasn't in the business of making a profit.
That's right.
The Army Corps of
That's right.
Engineers was in the business of either building for the Army or it had its civilian works
That's right.
division.
It was
Yeah.
altruistic.
And
Yeah.
it was.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
As the
And-
government is,
yeah.
is ideally
And
meant to be.
Edison's process shows us exactly that thing, because he was just inventing. And there would be times that he would run into a wall here, but then this other avenue would open up, and he'd go, I need to go and explore that.
Yes.
And if he was working to a grant-driven funding project with
Yes.
specific results,
He wouldn't have been able to
intended,
do that.
he wouldn't have been able to do that.
How
So-
was it funded?
He got people that just give him money.
Okay.
Yeah.
How about
And he sold patents for inventions that he made,
Yeah.
and so things were a lot less
Isn't-
expensive back then.
Isn't there
Awesome.
something about the invention of penicillin that falls into that kind of accidental category? I'm vaguely remembering the story of penicillin being, it was like a side benefit to some other research. Oh my goodness, now I'm going to drive myself crazy.
No, I
So-
love
So
that.
what is it? Hang on, let me see if I can find it.
Well, I do know on
History
another
of
tangent,
inventing penicillin.
in the Middle Ages,
Okay.
healers, women.
When you first in the
taking
Middle
care of
Ages, you mean like the 1500s?
Yeah, the 13 through the 1500s.
So here we go.
And they would collect spider webs, cow urine, and moldy bread, because all of those science has shown have beneficial
Medicinal qualities.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have the timeline. Well, I'm not going to read it all, but penicillin was discovered in 1928 by Alexander Fleming, a bacteriologist at St. Mary's Hospital in London. But it was not until 1939, 11 years later, that a group of scientists at Oxford University started intensive research. Fleming noticed that a mold growing on a culture of bacteria had killed the bacteria, identifying the mold as Penicillium notatum. When Fleming's initial work demonstrated the antibacterial effect of penicillin, it was later scientists who developed methods for mass producing and purifying penicillin for clinical use. So it doesn't quite describe it as an accident, but it wasn't it couldn't have been his primary focus if it was 1928 and then it was these other people in 1939.
Yeah,
that
it
really
wasn't
took
an
it up.
intended result.
He wasn't. It couldn't have been his focus because it took 11 years for other people to get on going.
They
Interesting.
addressed it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So we to
I
kind of.
don't want to spend your time catching up with.
Well, we'll talk.
What half hour, 45
We'll
minutes?
talk
that
as soon as
have
we end. But the main point here is innovation exists. It's not something that has happened and it's kind of like done. This is another joke I learned years ago. There would be people who would say, even like I think somebody who ran the patent office around 1920 made some bold statement. He said, everything that's ever going to be invented has been invented, because he was so full of himself that he thought this was
That's
this
egotistical
is as
driven.
far as we could go.
That's
And,
egotistical.
yeah, and then you know the flip side is you got people who like they heard Elvis Presley early on and said, and nobody's ever going to want to listen to this guy, so he's never going to be a success. We have to acknowledge that there are going to be naysayers, but that shouldn't stop us.
No.
Because if we have a passion for something, be it computers, you know, the first computers came out, and there were people who said, oh, well, maybe there will be 6 people who will want computers because they'll only be for universities. You can't know the value of something until it's really been presented
At your doorstep.
and not just perfected, but seen as having variations. You know, big computers are awesome, but so were little desktops that, you know, Apple and Microsoft ultimately championed. And I basically want people to have hope. That's one of the missions of the museum, is so that people can see the future is actually potentially better than the past. You know, our best days are not behind us. They can be ahead of us, but we have to be willing to learn
That's right.
that we don't know that there are solutions, and we have to be curious to want to seek out those solutions. And if we open our eyes and open our hearts, for example, W. Edwards Deming, who has been dead for over 30 years, actually has a lot to offer us today in the quest for a world of collaboration rather than a world of conflict.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I guess I'll end
No, I
things
appreciate
right
his
there.
philosophy.
Thank you.
I really do.
And now we're gonna
And
see.
unfortunately, it doesn't get recognized or adhered to, or just seems like it's just like not important.
Not yet.
So we're not going to follow it.
Not yet. Oh, and thank you for reminding me, in a manner of speaking, to help people understand that this is important. The museum is going to make its first ever appearance at a trade show. I guess it's a trade show. The AAA Route 66 Road Fest. It's kind of a trade show. It's a celebration of all things Route 66. And it's in Tulsa, June 21 and 22. And if you are in town or able to get yourself to Tulsa,
Does that fall? Sorry. Does that fall on a weekend?
it's a Friday and a Saturday.
Okay.
And not only is it a celebration of all things Route 66, but it's a celebration of cars in the form of a giant indoor, because it's a hot day, so it's an indoor car show. You can see everything you'd ever want to see, you know, Mustangs and Chevys and you name it, in the comfort of an air-conditioned exhibit hall. And you can see all kinds of folks celebrating Route 66, and you will be able to see this museum in its booth space celebrating not just the innovation of Route 66, but the innovation overall that helps power America forward.
That's great. That's
So,
great.
Thank
What
you
a
all for
blessing.
watching. Let me just click end live and see. If you end the video now, you'll be able to choose if you want to save or delete it. Oh.